I'm the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to read Chapter 3 of my bachelor thesis. This section is entitled Critique and Extension. In a move reminiscent of Max Weber's linking of the Protestant Calvinist work ethic to capitalist economics, Bataille reintroduces religion to the domain of political economy, but to rather opposite effect from Weber. For Weber, Calvinist thrift provided the right conditions for the development of capitalism due to its ethic of accumulation, investment, and reinvestment, while Bataille thinks that such behavior belongs to the domain of the profane and not the religious. Gu analyzes Bataille's move. He writes, "Whereas the profane is the domain of utilitarian consumption, the sacred is the domain of experience opened by the unproductive consumption of the surplus. What is sacrificed? The religious or artistic domain is not a simple superstructure of vague whims built on the economic infrastructure. It is itself economic, in the sense of a general economics founded on the expenditure of the excess, on the unproductive and aesthetic consumption of the surplus, through which the human being experiences the ultimate meaning of existence." In Gu's analysis, capitalism became the leading economic force through the complete desacralization of life inaugurated by Calvinism and carried to its limit by Marxism. This move was needed to break free from previous economic regimes in which religion played an important role in directing resources. The impulse towards sacrifice has to be minimized in capitalism because while such a form of consumption was glorious, it was one of pure economic loss which contradicts capitalist economic principles, which is based on utilitarian rationality as discussed in an earlier section. Gu notes that Bataille interprets our anthropological history as a unification of the two forces that have been considered individually the motors of human societies, the forces of religion and economics, since, until the birth of capitalism, every society is one of sacrificial expenditure, after which accumulation took center stage in a restrictive economy. Potlatch is Bataille's prime example of such sacrificial expenditures. Potlatch is a means of circulating wealth involving gift exchanges, throwing festival or banquets for the community, or a solemn destruction of riches by chiefs, lords, and merchants, among other successful people. These rituals are done to add luster to his person by displaying the favor of the gods who had given him everything. However, Gu disputes Bataille's account of capitalism and potlatch. Gu does not think that the current state of capitalism is the capitalism of the Calvinists, with its values of thrift, sobriety, and asceticism as portrayed by Weber and Bataille. According to Gu, such Calvinist capitalism has already been displaced by an ethic of consumption, desire, and pleasure, which makes Bataille general economy theory passé, since what Bataille prescribes as the antidote to his conception of capitalism is precisely the form that capitalism has adopted. According to Gu, such Calvinist capitalism has already been displaced by an ethic of consumption, desire, and pleasure, which makes Bataille's general economy theory passé, since what Bataille prescribes as the antidote to his conception of capitalism is precisely the form that capitalism has adopted. The current state of capitalism has gone beyond its beginnings rooted in restrictive economy to one where no society has wasted as much as contemporary capitalism, observes Gu. In addition, Gu points to the work of Gilder, who provides a reading of The Gift by Marcel Mauss, from which Bataille adapted his account of potlatch that differs from Bataille's interpretation. Gilder posits that potlatch-style giving is not something belonging only to primitive societies, but is at the heart of capitalism, drawing on Jean-Baptiste Say's economic law of how supply creates its own demand. He explains, "The unending offering of entrepreneurs, investing jobs, accumulating inventories, all long before any return is received, all without any assurance that the enterprise will not fail, constitute a pattern of giving that dwarfs in extent and in essential generosity any primitive right of exchange. Giving is the vital impulse and moral center of capitalism." In Gilder's account, demand for non-necessities is not assured, certainly not a priori, and is preceded by a supply which causes the demand by creating new desires. For Gilder, the element of giving in capitalism resides in suppliers taking the risk that their gift will not be reciprocated by demand, payment, and subsequently profits. According to Gu, even Mauser's own interpretation of gifts in the contemporary world is not the frenetic squandering envisioned by Bataille, but rather a state picture of the industrialist who creates family insurance funds, or a society who has national health insurance for its members, where the community gives to the workers something other than a simple salary. Clearly, Bataille's interpretation of potlatch is just one of several interpretations, and not necessarily even the most accurate one. Hence, Gu accuses Bataille of romanticizing primitive societies. Instead of the generous utopias that Bataille seems to suggest, Gu observes that primitive societies are extremely unequal, even cruelly hierarchical, where spectacular consumption is the tool with which the powerful maintain their position above the dazzled miserable masses. In Gu's account of post-industrial societies, the primacy of consumption has already arrived, and it is not quite what Bataille had envisioned. According to Gu, in such economies, the appeal to consumers to compete infinitely in unproductive consumption through comfort, luxury, technical refinement, the superfluous, allows for the development of production. Gu argues that the unproductive consumption of tobacco, alcohol, pleasure trips, and movies allows for productive profit-making industries. If one remains on strictly economic ground, it is in truth impossible to separate productive consumption from unproductive squandering, he writes. How can Bataille respond to Gu's and Gilder's critique? Noyes agrees with Gu that Bataille's economy of excess might have traction on the asceticism of the Protestant ethic of accumulatory capitalism, which seems to come into strange congruence with a postmodern capitalism of realized excess. They indeed correctly depict Bataille's view of capitalism as an economics of accumulation, since Bataille sees capitalism as a system where there is a preference for an increase of wealth to its immediate use. Bataille was, however, clearly aware of the existence of consumerism, which includes luxury and waste, himself raising the use of alcohol as an example of consuming without a return, though he was referring to the consumer's lack of return and not the producer's. Besides, the term conspicuous consumption was already invented 50 years before the publication of The Cursed Share, and Weber has also written about heartless hedonism. Ische Lander details a shift in Bataille's thought between the Accursed Share's first and later volumes. In Volume 3, in what might be a refinement of his view, Bataille writes, "Those who mean to lead the world and change it opt for accumulation. Those who prefer that others lead it aim at non-productive consumption." This suggests that Bataille is not oblivious to the consumption of modern capitalism. However, while the masses may participate in such a capitalism of consumption as noted by Gu, those in power remain in accumulation mode, perhaps including the industries that Gu refers to that profit off the unproductive consumption of the masses, and Gilder's gift-giving entrepreneurs whose gifts are not pure acts of generosity but ultimately aim at profits. Bataille also admits that methodologically, it is difficult to distinguish between productive and unproductive expenditures. Real life, composed of all sorts of expenditures, know nothing of purely productive expenditure. In actuality, it knows nothing of purely unproductive expenditure either, he writes. Regardless, Bataille claims that the kind of luxury and waste that present and past societies engage in are insufficient to avert the dangers he warned about. Ancient societies found relief in festivals. Some erected admirable monuments that had no useful purposes. We use the excess to multiply services that make life smoother, and we are led to reabsorb part of it by increasing leisure time. But these diversions have always been inadequate. Their existence in excess, nevertheless, in certain respects, has perpetually doomed multitudes of human beings and great quantities of useful goods to the destruction of wars, he writes. Wasteful festivals, monuments, and services from past and present-day consumerist capitalism can only absorb part of the excess. They are mere diversions. Since there is excess left over, excess remains a problem. The possibility of war due to excess remains, and may possibly be exacerbated by the profitability of Gu's industries of unproductive consumption and Gilder's giving entrepreneurs. Following Bataille's reasoning, the generation of even more profits from both groups increases the danger of catastrophe, since there will be even greater excess, leading to even more pressures on the limits of growth. We have hence not escaped Bataille's problem of limits outlined in an earlier section, excess remains a problem. Even if we dispute the details of Bataille's account, we must acknowledge that there are problems of excess. They are not merely the flip side of problems of scarcity. Problems of excess, such as obesity resulting from overeating and environmental pollution from too much industrial activity and too many vehicles, differ from problems of scarcity, such as insufficient food, underproduction of goods, or a lack of transportation. Hence, they require different solutions. They also urgently need solving, with Bataille's theory of general economy presenting a useful theoretical lens to examine such problems. Abbott demonstrates one such fruitful use of Bataille's theory to develop strategies dealing with the problems of excess. 1/3 of all food produced went to waste, while 1/10 of humanity starved, according to the United Nations. It estimates that 10% of the world's population are living in extreme poverty, struggling to fulfill the most basic needs like health, education, and access to water and sanitation. Some people die of thirst, while others flush their toilets with drinkable water. Such gross inequalities seem unfair and downright paradoxical, though in line with Bataille's idea of the dominance of scarcity from the perspective of the particular and a condition of excess from the perspective of the general. Particular existence always risks succumbing for a lack of resources. It contrasts with general existence, whose resources are in excess and for which death has no meaning, he writes. These varying states of scarcity and excess present their own unique sets of difficulties. However, according to Abbott, economists tend to ignore the problems of excess, treating it only as the flip side of scarcity, and hence not requiring separate analysis, given the economist's already elaborate study of scarcity. He calls this the identity argument and argues that such an identification of scarcity as the inverse of excess is a mistake, since they are not necessarily conceptual contraries. To understand how this false opposition became a presupposition in economics, Abbott examines the historical development of economic thought. While contemporary economics is centered on scarcity, older seminal economic works have considered abundance and its problems. Bernard Mandeville's Fable of the Bees, written in 1714, is a text credited with inspiring Smith's conception of the invisible hand, and it speaks about how individuals, by striving after excess, creates social abundance. However, by 1798, Thomas Malthus has laid the roots for the identity argument, ignoring the advantages of excess population such as military might and cheap labor, focusing instead on how it would create food scarcity. David Ricardo later formalized Malthus' conception, producing the definitive theory of scarcity that has sustained subsequent economics. In Ricardo's theory, scarcity is a source of value, while what is excessive is worthless in terms of exchange value. Since excess cannot be priced, the concept is discarded for theoretical parsimony. Marx likewise focuses on scarcity, despite writing in an age of rapid economic expansion due to the Industrial Revolution in Britain. He views excess in the form of overproduction as a state of affairs common in capitalism, emphasizing the resulting scarcity of work. This idea became mainstream by the 19th century, with excess production seen as problematic since it led to low prices and unemployment. Keynes, the economist credited with bringing the world out of the Great Depression with his macroeconomic general theory of employment, interest, and money in 1936, did, however, conceive of a more optimistic future, predicting that his grandchildren will enjoy 15-hour work weeks because of a newfound bounty of nature realized through technological innovation. He writes, "For the first time since his creation, man will be faced with his permanent problem. How to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him to live wisely and agreeably and well." However, the dismal science of economics manages to turn excess into scarcity for purposes of analysis by economists more familiar with the theoretical framework of scarcity. Even in such a world of excess and leisure as imagined by Keynes, there will be a scarcity of time to enjoy them, since there are only so few hours in a day to fill with so many competing pleasures, according to Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker. The notion of excess as a precursor to the better things in life predates economic thought. Aristotle explains that only after our physical needs and desires are met, when there is a state of excess, could knowledge for its own sake then commence. A popular modern rendition of Aristotle's idea is Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where Maslow argues that basic needs must first be met before higher order needs and wants can be pursued. The urge to write poetry, the desire to acquire an automobile, the interest in American history, the desire for a new pair of shoes, are in the extreme case forgotten or become of secondary importance. For the man who is extremely and dangerously hungry, no other interests exist but food. A state of excess is required for one to achieve the next tier in Maslow's hierarchy, which finally culminates in the need for self-actualization after the satisfaction of physiological, safety, love, and esteem needs, respectively. However, such account suggests an opposition between excess and scarcity, as if they are mutually exclusive and opposite concepts. Abbott objects to this translation of the problems of excess into problems of scarcity, which in Becker's case is the translation of excess goods into a lack of time to enjoy them. This objection is important because such translation is what allows economists to ignore excess as a separate question. Abbott argues that scarcity and excess are on a spectrum rather than oppositional, becoming oppositional only in limit cases. Refuting Becker's case, Abbott explains that treating time like a budget constraint is incorrect because the opportunity cost of time is not the same as the opportunity cost of money. Buying one thing prevents the purchase of another with the same dollars. However, time does not behave like that since multiple utilities may be achieved in the same expenditure of time or even multiplied. Prima facie, excess seems to be either a nice problem to have or a non-problem. Abbott considers the industrial production process. Production requires multiple inputs, and if just one input is insufficient, the product cannot be produced. However, if all inputs are just sufficient or in excess, production can proceed, with the excess posing no difficulty of production failure, but perhaps posing a storage difficulty. Hence, if excess is problematic, it is problematic for different reasons than scarcity. Excess is something fundamentally different from scarcity, and therefore the problems of excess need to be treated differently from the problems of scarcity. Bataille suggests that a disregard for the problems of excess, common among economists, including those as renowned as Malthus and Becker, is due to the economy not being considered in its general sense. The mistake, according to Bataille, is that economics adopts the methodology of the sciences, reducing phenomena into discrete operations based on an average individual. We then extend this understanding to the whole of society by aggregating the individual outcomes. Economic science merely generalizes the isolated situation. It restricts its object to operations carried out with a view to a limited end, that of economic men. However, we are not merely homo economicus, whose actions are only driven by economic considerations. Instead, we are destined to useless consumption, and the choice we are confronted with is how excess is to be expended as homo ecologicus, human beings qua living organisms interacting with others in the entire domain of human activities, including non-economic activities as far afield as religion, art, and eroticism, where formidable energies are consumed for the celebration of the gods, the glory of the great, or the Dionysic pleasure of the humble. Hence, we need to reform our thinking altogether if we want to find a solution to economic problems and avoid catastrophe. Abbott, drawing on Bataille's general economy theory, tries to do this by understanding excess as a class of its own. He examines the causes of the problems of excess by distinguishing two types of excess on the level of the individual and society. Souffle, an excess of one thing, and welter, an excess that arises from too many things. From this, he proposes two classes of strategies to deal with the problems of excess. First, reduction strategies, which cut down the amount of excess. These have two subtypes: A, defensive strategies, which ignores the excess, and B, reactive strategies, which simplifies excess by reducing it to more manageable terms. Secondly, rescaling strategies, which change the definition of desirability. These also have two subtypes: A, creative strategies, which accepts existing excess and increases it by making excess and its enjoyment central to life, and B, adaptive strategies, which make a virtue of the excess. Abbott account supports and extends Bataille's theory by demonstrating the need for excess to be analysed as its own economic problem and by proposing a set of broad approaches to counter the problems of excess. In conclusion, has the accursed share accomplished the Copernican transformation Bataille has set out to achieve? The accursed share is the part of wealth that is cursed. For Bataille, this is the excess after man's needs are met. Actors in capitalistic societies attempt to control residual wealth by saving it, and then subsequently unleashing these savings through investments. If profitable, such investments lead to an even greater amount of excess and diminishing returns, thus only delaying the inevitable expenditure. The choice we have is to expend the excess in a glorious or catastrophic way. It is a question of acceptability and not utility. Bataille presents this method as empirical, drawing from nature and history, with potlatch being an important example of the kind of sacrificial expenditure he advocates, away from the capitalism of thrift. However, Gu thinks that capitalism today has already taken on the form of consumption, desire, and pleasure that Bataille preaches. A possible Bataillean response is that while the masses may be consuming non-productively, the powerful are still accumulating wealth. In addition, such spending is still insufficient to solve the problem of excess. The problem of excess has been typically studied as the flip side of scarcity, since economists have a well-developed framework of scarcity to work from. However, excess and scarcity are fundamentally different, requiring different treatment, leading Abbott to propose strategies specific to countering the problems of excess. Despite the contestability of some details of Bataille's account, such as his solar cosmology and his conception of potlatch, his conception of general economy remains coherent, credible, and is successful in challenging our understanding of economics, which currently has a restrictive rather than a general perspective. Which perspective is prevalent determines our behavior, since they lead to different ethical norms. A mindset of scarcity drives wealth accumulation and inequality, leaving the world open to catastrophe, while a mindset of superabundance drives generosity, leading to a raising of the overall living standards of the global population and glory for the generous. Which mindset is ideal for us will lie somewhere between the two perspectives, since either extreme will be untenable or unsustainable. Given how much the global economy has tilted to the side of scarcity, Bataille's The Accursed Share can be viewed as a corrective to help us move to a more generous position. Thank you.